Yo guys, F1 22 is finally here, and so is my first F1 22 car setup. The first track in the calendar is Bahrain, and this is our ultimate race setup for this circuit. This is optimised for longer distance races in my team and career mode, and was created using a racing wheel. Before I go any further, if you're as excited as I am about F1 22, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel because I'll be releasing a lot of F1 22 content over the coming days and weeks, including more setups. But back to this Bahrain setup. I'm going to jump straight in and look at the aero setup. For this year's game, Cody's have changed the aerodynamics quite significantly. Now we have a range from 0 to 50, which is consistent across every track. And I say that because in last year's game, Cody's pre-tweaked the aerodynamic setup for every track, meaning a 6.6 wing setup produced different amounts of downforce at every circuit. In F1 22, however, that's completely changed, meaning a wing setup of 25-25 will produce the same amount of downforce at every circuit on the game. This gives us much more control over our aero setup, allowing us to run more extreme setups if we wanted to. However, I'm going to keep things pretty balanced with this Bahrain setup. I've gone with a front wing angle of 22, which should give us a good amount of front downforce into some of the slower corners and into the tricky second sector. Then I've gone for a rear wing angle of 25. This is because in this year's game, the rear wing produces more downforce than last year. However, it's also less efficient, meaning you'll start to generate a lot of excess drag if you run it too high. This aero setup should give you a good amount of front downforce to prevent understeer, while the rear wing angle will ensure your car is both quick down the straights and can hang on through the fast turns 11 and 12. Just like in previous games, we can run a pretty aggressive on-throttle diff setup. I've opted for a value of 88. This should provide a lot of push through the medium to high speed corners. But if you're struggling to find traction out of the slower turns 1 and 10, you can lower your on-throttle diff manually via the MFD. For the off-throttle diff, I've gone with a setup of 58, as this will help rotate your car into corners at slower speeds. The suspension geometry setup carries across from F1 2021 quite nicely. In F1 22, I've gone for a front camber setup of -2.5 and a rear camber setup of -1.8. This helps to produce a car that's generally kind on its tyres throughout a race weekend. For the front toe, I've lowered this right down to 0.05, and I've done the same for the rear toe by lowering it to 0.2. This approach will minimise drag from the tyres, giving us better acceleration down the long straights around Bahrain. The suspension is probably the part of the F1 22 car setups that's seen the biggest changes, other than the expanded aero setup options. The cars this year are much stiffer due to the lower ride heights and ground effect aero. This allows us to run a stiffer suspension setup without producing too much excess tyre wear. In last year's game, it was common for the front suspension to be set up much softer than the rear to help produce a little extra oversteer into corners. In F1 22, this is completely flipped around. Instead, run a stiffer front suspension and anti-roll bar setup with both sets of 9 at the front and 3 at the rear. For the ride height, set this to 3 at the front and 4 at the rear. This ensures we get enough ground clearance to avoid bottoming out during elevation changes and over bumps, which is a real risk in F1 22. For the brakes, not much has changed. Go for 100% brake pressure and 52% brake bias. In F1 22, you can set your brake bars to 50% without much consequence. However, I always prefer taking this ever so slightly away from 50% to give a little more front end stability under braking. The tyre pressure setup is also slightly different in F1 22, mainly due to the stiffer tyres and larger 18-inch wheel rims. I've gone for the combination of softer front tyres with lower pressures of 23.3 psi on both fronts, then opt for stiffer rears of 22.5. I can imagine some setups will run even higher tyre pressures, which will help performance, although around Bahrain, running the rear tyre pressures at 22.5 seems to be about the limit. Beyond this, you'll start to run into rear tyre wear problems during the race. Remember, Bahrain is rear limited, so it's harder on those rear tyre pressures. And that concludes our first F1 22 car setup of the year, guys. Bahrain's always a fun track to race around, and that hasn't changed in this year's game. This car setup is pretty different in places from last year's setups due to the new technical regulations. However, this setup should produce a well-balanced car that's fun to drive consistently with good tyre life to see you through a full race. Let me know how you're getting on with the new game and with this car setup in the comments below, and I do read every comment I get and try to reply to as many as I can. If you've enjoyed this video, hit that like button as it will really help this channel grow. and subscribe to our channel because I'll be releasing more F1 22 setups in the coming days. But for now guys, enjoy the game and I'll see you on track.